What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so getting into Tom Taylor's Hunt for Wolverine Adamantium agenda, to be honest, when I first heard about this, I thought it was just going to be like a reworked Extinction Agenda, right? For those of you guys who don't know, Extinction Agenda was a story that came out in 1990, and it was designed to kind of create this transition between what were the New Mutants into X-Force, as well as like the new reworked version of X-Factor and even the X-Men themselves. Largely, it centered around Cameron Hodge, who had basically just been a holdover since the old Luis and Walter Simonson X-Factor run. He was a guy who backed the X-Factor team and then ultimately turned out to be a bad guy. He was just kind of a guy who was there for a while. I know by that point he was a cyborg. 1990s comics, well, really it was 1990, so it was really even before 1990s comics. But still, nonetheless, I thought it was going to be like a reworked version of that. Not at all. It's actually kind of cool. It's a really interesting concept. Now, like all the other Hunt for Wolverine mini stories, this basically focuses in some form or fashion on the character of Wolverine himself, classic Logan. And it really kind of sets the stage for like what comes after, after the events of Wolverine's return, and really like how these various teams deal with it. Now, initially, this picks up with New Avengers. And to be honest, I feel like kind of an idiot because I jumped on Twitter yesterday or the day before, and I asked people, I asked a question, I said, an Adamantium Agenda, is it the Mighty Avengers or the New Avengers that it picks up with? Because when the New Avengers okay, a little bit of history here. I know a lot of you guys are just like, get to the point. A little bit of history here. So we'll say 1964 is when the Avengers first popped up, which meant that running up to like 2004, they had essentially been going on for, 40 years or something along those lines. And so what ended up happening is under Joe Quesada, Marvel got rid of them, right? They were just like, disband the Avengers, cancel it. So we got Avengers Disassemble. And then almost immediately after that happened, Brian Michael Bendis reworked the Avengers team and gave us New Avengers. Picking up with the New Avengers team, what this does is it kind of goes back when the team was relatively new, not brand new, but was relatively new, and it basically picks up with like a bomb that's been set. Now this, in this initial iteration, I knew right off the bat what direction they were going to go in, and it's basically that Wolverine is the one that stays behind, because what they say is that this bomb has basically a kind of proximity alarm. If anybody were to touch it, try to dismantle it, it would detonate. If they get too far away, it would detonate. It's one of these things where it's like they're all kind of screwed, so somebody has to stay behind, and ultimately it ends up being Wolverine. Now there are some funny moments here, which is kind of cool. There's a funny little moment here when Spider-Man says, well, okay, I'll be the one to do it. And Wolverine chimes in and says, no, man, the radioactive spider that bit you is not going to be able to bring you back. You're not going to be able to heal from it. Now, Spider-Man's initial reaction is, how do you know that? And Wolverine's like, come on, dude, you're Spider-Man. Everyone's heard your origin story. And it's kind of like, who hasn't heard the origin story of Spider-Man before? And like the one agent from S.H.I.E.L.D. just kind of raises their hand. Which is a funny little thing. This is kind of a big deal because you got Jessica Jones, you got Luke Cage, and this is designed to kind of say, these are the sacrifices that Wolverine made. Now, by and large, given the whole publication history of Wolverine, things like this could be overlooked pretty easily, right? Wolverine, he heals from everything, so it doesn't really matter. But if you start looking at this from the perspective of the character, Wolverine is going to essentially die yet again. Like, he's going to be blown up yet again, and it's crushing. And that's one of the things that Jessica Jones kind of hits on, and it's not something you see very often. That in this moment, she just kind of says, look, thank you for what you're doing here, because without this, we would all die. And Wolverine's kind of like, yeah, that's the nature of the beast. Now, the crazy thing about this is that as the bomb begins to detonate, Wolverine recognizes something. And when he recognizes something, when he activates this bomb and when he recognizes what's there, he basically says, like, you're going to have a ton of explaining to do, meaning something's off here. And so what we end up doing is picking up with Tony Stark, reminiscing to himself and musing over what had gone on with Wolverine. And the idea here is that Tony Stark says, I owe him one. Like, I owe Wolverine a pretty big thing. Now, the indication really seems to be that Tony Stark owes him because Wolverine basically detonated the bomb in place and kept it from killing tons and tons and tons of people. But what he also says, he kind of chimes into Spider-Man, who defeats the Vulture immediately, which makes sense because the Vulture sucks. And he basically says, look, I have information on the idea that the DNA of a superhero is going to be sold. Now, it makes perfect sense that it's going to be Wolverine. That's the one thing that really kind of stands out. When it comes to his character, one thing to bear in mind, he's the most sought after person in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. Now, a lot of that's done because of the fact of his popularity. I mean, Wolverine, by the time his comic had been canceled, and by the time he had died in the death of Wolverine in the final issue, he had appeared in some 12,000 comic books. He's been on pretty much every single superhero team. Out of all the superhero teams that exist, we can nix off like 3 and say he hasn't really been on those. But for the most most part, he's the most sought after person, because in the Marvel universe, he has a healing factor. He's one of the most trained assassins. People constantly chase after his DNA. And especially after he had died, it's like, hey, look, if we can clone Wolverine, then we can have our very own version of him that can essentially follow the whole plot thread of X-23, minus her escaping and running off, in the sense that he can basically be someone we send in for a particular mission. We can auction him off to the highest bidder. So we can say, look, you pay $10 million, he'll assassinate some political figure somewhere. These are kind of big deals. And so what we end up finding out is this entire deal is going down on a submarine. With this particular auction, what they're doing is they're conducting it in such a way that no one sees the face of anybody else. And the reason why this works is because, for the most part, it's easier for the villains to remain anonymous. If you're a villain in the Marvel universe and you're auctioning off, what is sure to be one of the most big ticket items to ever have been auctioned off, it's going to draw a lot of attention from a lot of different people. But that's where the danger comes into play. If these guys were to take off their masks and then whoever won ended up winning, then somebody would know who they are and they could come after them later on. And so that's why it's really important for them to keep their faces hidden and to keep themselves disguised. Now, the other half of this is that it's also done for the sake of the story. Of course, one of these guys here is intelligently dressed up as one of the little things from Toy Story, one of the little guys with the three eyes, the little vending machine guys. Oh, those guys do. I love those guys. Don't really remember too much of them, but I remember laughing a lot when I first saw them. But still, it's kind of interesting here, because with them wearing all these different costumes and so on, they kind of go through like the early bidding phase. And one of the guys is actually dressed up as Iron Man, which is kind of cool. He's wearing an Iron Man mask. And what he says here is the big ticket item that's up for auction, the DNA of this member of the superhero community they've gotten their hands on, is basically Danielle Cage. The daughter of Luke and Jessica, which is like the least interesting thing ever. And it's kind of funny because it's not like Tom Taylor was building this up as serious. He was just kind of like, yeah, everybody's kind of pissed. Everybody was kind of expecting this to be like a pretty big ticket thing, except for like, Luke and Jessica, who basically freak off that their daughter's DNA was stolen. Now, the other half of this is switching back to the aftermath of this explosion with Wolverine. Of course, you end up having Tony Stark, who goes in there, starts hunting around, and ultimately ends up finding Logan, who immediately enters into a Bazooka Rage and goes to kill him. Now, that's par for the course when it comes to Wolverine. One thing to bear in mind, when it comes to Wolverine's character, he has what's called a Bazooka Rage, and that's when he just loses all semblance of self, really enters into like an animalistic state, and just goes absolutely crazy. Like it's really the most dangerous version of his character. But he immediately goes into like a temporary Bazooka Rage and then regains himself, and then essentially Tony Stark starts talking to him. Now, of course, punching his claws into the head of Iron Man. As we know, in multiple instances in Marvel Comics, Tony Stark doesn't really fly around in his suit that often anymore, or at least he doesn't enter into his suit when he goes into like a hostile area, which is to say an area just like pulsing with radiation. It doesn't make any sense for him to do that. Just send in basically a satellite suit and have the satellite suit look around while Tony Stark pilots it remotely. But when Wolverine's talking to the suit, by proxy, talking to Iron Man, what he essentially says is, you have to make a promise to me. Like I know what's going on here and I'll keep your secret, but you have to make a promise to me. And the promise is, if I end up dying and anybody ever gets their hands on my DNA, then you have to make sure that they're basically taken out, that they don't use me for some kind of test subject. They don't like clone me. They don't resurrect me and then turn me into like a mindless monster or anything like that. Because Wolverine's been down that path before. Like he was taken by Hydra in the hand. He was brainwashed into becoming a villain, and then in a what if story killed the Marvel universe. But like he's been down that road before, and he's been used multiple times. It's really the MO of his character. And so in this instance, he says, okay, fine, then I'll go ahead and make sure this doesn't happen. Now, ultimately, what ends up going on is like basically Tony Stark ends up bidding on the DNA of Danielle Cage to make sure nobody gets it. And it's kind of funny because once he goes through and starts doing this, it's really like for the benefit of Luke and Jessica, but they're really none too happy about it. Now, the problem with this is that somebody ends up realizing Tony Stark is Tony Stark. And so when they basically go to meet, as soon as they bounce out of there, they go to meet that guy, he kind of makes this funny comment, like, I kind of thought it would go for a lot more than it did, but it didn't. But it's also kind of like, hey man, you have Danielle Cage. Who the hell wants Danielle Cage's DNA? Now, Tony Stark kind of chimes in and says, I'm also after the DNA of Wolverine. And this guy says, yeah, I can give you that. How much are you willing to pay? And Tony Stark's like, yeah, like $6 million. And so it's kind of a cool thing because it means this guy has access to a vast array of DNA samples. And the reason for this comes with the arrival of Mr. Sinister. Now, this fits in perfect for a variety of reasons. One, because Mr. Sinister's taken over the body of Tony Stark before, but two, because one of the things that you usually see when it comes to Marvel Comics and when it comes to the X-Men, kind of a sidetrack here for a second, when it comes to the villains of the X-Men, you don't usually see them cross over with other members of the superhero community. It took almost like 7 or 8 years for like Magneto to face off against the Avengers for the first time. X-Men villains stay X-Men villains and they don't really cross over. But it's kind of a cool thing to see like Sinister pop up and basically Luke Cage and Jessica Jones and Spider-Man and Tony Stark all react knowing exactly who he is. Now, a lot of this really stems from the fact that Sinister is a well-known villain. I mean, he's a planetary threat, but him lashing out like this means they have to leave because Sinister's not a foe who's easily stopped. But the other half of this equation is revealed when we end up finding out the person who identified Tony Stark as being Tony Stark is actually Laura Kinney, is X-23, who's stowed away as well because, of course, she heard the same thing. Now, again, this also makes sense for her character because one of the things that has really been hit on for all new Wolverine is that for Laura Kinney, she's operated in and out of Madripoor. So showing up here and facing off against Sinister is really nothing new for her. Now, of course, she slices off his hand in the process, which means that, you know, he's kind of screwed. He's basically kind of left hanging. And then, of course, he goes to attack like the rest, everybody else. And then, Jessica Jones kicks in and she jumps in, different things like that, so on and so forth. While the whole place is flooding, you end up having Jessica Jones push Luke Cage against the breach in the submarine, and Spider-Man webs him up and leaves him there. He's got impenetrable skin. It's going to stop the water. Then again, of course, Laura Kinney cuts off the other hand of Sinister, which means he in turn is forced to retreat. Now, retreating back and basically going to figure out where he's located at means they end up having to show up at his base of operations. We end up finding out that he's in a place called the Desolation Islands. Now, the Desolation Islands, if I'm being honest, really kind of feel like a modern version of the Savage Land, like Avalon or something along those lines. I feel like it's kind of a new version of that, but Sinister always does that. Like, he usually doesn't stay in one main base of operations for a very long time. He really kind of like bounces around. That way nobody can ever really track him. And so because of this whole thing, of course, getting the information out of Declan Fay, the person that worked for Sinister and gained this stuff in the first place, where he was running off and just kind of selling it to the highest bidder, what this means is that they can't simply just enter Desolation Islands, right? They can't just show up there with like a vessel or something like that because the defenses will shoot them all down. They basically need to be small projectiles. And so what happens is like everybody gets Iron Man armors. It's pretty cool. I just want to say Luke Cage's armor looks badass. Like, it's literally a giant mace attached to his hand. It looks pretty beast. Jessica Jones is okay. I think this Spider-Man armor is actually cooler than the Iron Spider armor. And then of course X-23 gets her own suit as well. So it's kind of interesting that like everybody gets Iron Man armors. But busting into the facility, what they end up realizing is that Sinister's not necessarily there. But what Sinister has been doing is basically stockpiling the DNA of every being on planet Earth. Like every human, every superhero, the whole 9 yards. Now again, this follows perfectly in line with the charter of Sinister. That's why he's so dangerous, is because he's constantly stockpiling and trying to find ways to create the perfect villain, the perfect being, somebody he can use for his own ends. We don't really know what the plans for these are. And that's the big question that they have, that Sinister is very, very intelligent. So one, he would have physical copies, but then he would also have digital backups. And so the response is, okay, download the digital backups and then in turn, destroy the physical copies. The problem they end up running into is that none of the mutants are there. All the mutant files are basically gone. They've all been erased. And then of course there's all the remaining files for everybody else. Now, if I were a gambling man, if I were a betting man, I would say, given the fact that we're dealing in Desolation Islands, given the fact that we're dealing with Wolverine, and given the fact that we're dealing with Mr. Sinister and all these different genes, I would say that we're dealing with Satara. I would say that's probably who this is. Now, Satara, for those of you guys who don't know, she goes all the way back. I'm pretty sure it's a she, goes all the way back to Wolverine Punisher Revelation. This was back in 1999. And this was a crossover that dealt with with a woman by the name of Revelation who actually emitted a death aura. And the entire basis behind this death aura is that individuals who come into contact with it, unless they have a healing factor, will die. But there was basically a recording by Satara that was left behind that would give Wolverine knowledge on how to defeat Revelation. Now, of course, Satara herself, whatever you want to call him, she was affiliated with the Morlocks down below the tunnels in New York. I'm pretty sure that's what we're dealing with here. I could be wrong, but I feel like that's the direction that we're going in, because you're just talking about a return of a character that nobody would really remember, that very few people recall, and would essentially be new to like 90% of people who are reading Marvel Comics right now. Actually, I would go out on a limb and I would say 99.9% of people who are reading Marvel Comics right now had never heard of Satara. I'd say that's probably what's going on. But anyway, of course, we end up finding out that basically everybody here has been killed. They've been absolutely slaughtered. And in turn, what's left of the files are basically downloaded. Now, of course, this basically meets with the arrival of Mr. Sinister, who's healed himself because, of course, he has a healing factor. That's kind of his thing. And then, of course, it's the rest of the superhero team demolishing Sinister quite readily. I mean, taking it to him pretty quickly. quickly. Now, in reality, this fight probably shouldn't have happened, probably shouldn't have ended that fast. I mean, you're talking about a guy that can hold his own against Apocalypse. I mean, not for long, but can hold his own. And if Apocalypse were to show up here on the scene, they would all die. They really wouldn't stand a chance. I mean, how could they possibly stand a chance against a guy who can grow to like 2,000 feet tall and has every conceivable superpower shy of reality warping? So, I mean, he's pretty damn formidable. Now, of course, Sinister is not nearly that powerful, but he's still pretty damn powerful in his own right. So it kind of sucks to see things sort of fall away a little bit, but jumping back to the past with Wolverine again, what we end up finding out is the secret he's harboring is that this weapon that was here, this bomb that had gone off, was Stark technology. It was Stark tech. And so basically it's Wolverine saying, you do this favor for me, you make sure nobody ever uses me as an experiment, and I will keep your secrets safe. I will let nobody know that you're the person who's doing this, that you're the person that had this bomb. Now, the other half of this is that it seems from what Wolverine tells us, this bomb was built as like a deterrent, that had Iron Man lost Civil War, that possibly this bomb would have been used. And it's essentially like Wolverine sitting down and saying, like, what you've done here over the course of your entire career is just consistently screw things up. You almost destroyed your company because you were an alcoholic. You almost lost everybody that meant anything to you because you were an alcoholic. You've almost died on several occasions, and you actually died once. Everything you touch dies. You have to get it together. You've screwed this up. You have to move things in a direction to where the world becomes a better place. And so this is kind of Tom Taylor sort of injecting a bit of a retcon in to say why Iron Man had this kind of paradigm shift. Why he had this massive change. Because where Sinister tries to bargain and say, look, take what you want, take the information you want, but leave the digital files here, Iron Man recollects back to the promise he made to Wolverine and says, we got to destroy this all. I promised Wolverine that I would destroy all this. It's all got to go. It's all got to disappear, and it's all got to be eliminated, so that even if Wolverine's files aren't here, these can't be used for some kind of a nefarious purpose. So all these things are annihilated in their entirety. And so it's basically him just kind of picking up, and after the aftermath of all this, him just kind of picking up and saying, one of the things that I found here, going through and looking at those files, Tony Stark says, my job is to be extremely intelligent. My job is to see the things no one else sees. It's one of the reasons why I'm one of the most knowledgeable people out there in the Marvel Universe. And as I was going through those files, I only got a glimpse. But what I've learned here is that one of the mutants that exists out there in the X-Men community is not a mutant. They basically had their genes modified to make them look like a mutant, but they're not a mutant. Somebody out there is a fraud. Somebody out there is a fake, and we got to figure out who that person is. Continuing on into basically what seems to be like dead ends, which is going to be kind of cool, I think, and it's going to be interesting because hopefully it turns out to be Iron Man versus the X-Men. That's really kind of what I want to see. It's high time we get like an Iron Man versus the X-Men story. By God, the guy's been around for almost 50 years. It's time for us to see that. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.